Like, what is consciousness, actually?
You can only change what you can measure. No, I think we will get to the point of answering it.
So, welcome to the IDUN Technologies podcast. My name is Mark Malnikovic, and I'm joined today by Kai Lutz.
Nice to be here, Mark. Thanks for inviting me and for this podcast.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here. I'm essentially a test engineer and an application engineer by IDUN Technologies, but Kai is essentially our resident expert on neuroscience and psychology. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to IDUN?
Sure. As you mentioned, I've got an education as a neuroscientist. It was quite long that I learned to know the guys working at IDUN, the founders. I learned to know in 2016 already. I've always had the wish when I was in academia to be a little more on the side of application. Mm-hmm. And that's why I founded a company with my wife together, just as a kind of a side business or a hobby, more or less. Mm-hmm. And that's how I got in contact with IDUN. And I saw that they are really pushing forward, having development of electrodes, which I always found as a big problem in neuroscience when we worked with EEG, that the electrodes they use are cumbersome to attach, or they are really uncomfortable. And I've seen there are guys that really push forward improving that.
But why are you in? Like, how'd you come to neuroscience to begin with, actually? Because you've been in the Zurich area, I guess, for a few years now, like myself.
Yeah, yeah, quite a while. On neuroscience, I had two ideas what to do in life in terms of occupation. One was architecture, and the other was psychology. And that's both not really neuroscience, but psychology. It turned out for me that at the time when I started to think about what to study and where to study, psychology was very philosophical. That's what I didn't really like about it, but I still found the questions very, very interesting. The big questions about consciousness, the questions about emotions. So I decided to go for psychology, and I realized at that time the methods come up to try and explain how the brain works and how it creates all those phenomena that I am interested in.
Like, what is consciousness, actually?
Yeah, that's what philosophers still debate about. What is it exactly? Mm-hmm. And I always felt like we get farther and we get faster ahead if we are more pragmatic and see. Just at that time, it was called the correlations between the neurons, the neural correlates of some phenomenon that we can really measure in terms of behavior. Mm-hmm. So the relation between behavior and brain, that was what I actually was interested in. At that time, it was pretty much excluding those complex phenomena like consciousness. Mm-hmm. And still, consciousness is just about the hardest to tackle. And it's a emergent property that is made up of many components. Like you have to remember things in order to develop consciousness. You have to have a certain state of awareness. You have to be in a certain state of like activity states. You don't have to be asleep. I mean, there are parts of consciousness which are well investigated, but how to put it all together in terms of how to come to the several states of consciousness, this is still debated even in theory. So I think it's really
like this
hard.
idea of like quantum consciousness and like transferable consciousness. Do you think that's a reality, or is that really more of a philosophical question that science will know or answer?
No, I think we will get to the point of answering it. Even other philosophical debates, that at the moment they are philosophical, and it's important to lead those philosophical debates because the philosophists come up with clear definitions of what to investigate. Sometimes the problem, I think, is those definitions don't, well, are not the easiest way to approach the physical correlates of what we think is there. So sometimes it would be easier to study other things, even if they are not if they are not so appealing in the first thought. Yeah.
So how do you? I mean, in your background, you've done a lot of, I mean, just scientific research, right? And you are looking at forming a company. I mean, I think also in the ETH, in the Zurich, let's say the Swiss area, where there's this idea of hard science, deep tech, and then entrepreneurship. And there's a lot of encouragements now to go from lab to market and building products. But what are some of the challenges that you've seen or felt personally in going from this mindset of researcher to product and market fit?
I think it's one of the challenges is probably the question of how safe is the knowledge that you build upon. You know, with academia and research, we try to be as safe as possible, and time doesn't really matter. I think that's a big difference. On the other hand, the transition also involves like doing things that you see they are relevant, and there is an imminent need to answer questions. And so time does matter. And what we work on in a more industry environment is probably having more impact. And we sometimes have to take some risks in order to, well, maybe build upon knowledge which is not 100% safe, but it will turn out. Either we have gone the right way or we have gone the wrong way, and we will have to start over. But it's something, it's something
that word impact is really interesting, because like for many researchers, I think there's sometimes this feeling that you can be very emotionally invested in what you're doing, but you don't know what the impact is ever going to be on the work and all the time you put into writing papers and publishing. So now that you're in a hot Zurich startup working on neurotechnology, what impact do you want to have with your work?
For me, it is very gratifying to see that what I do is really used by other people and not only read. I mean, what we see in academia is whether people cite your work and whether they read your work, but not really whether it's ever used, and it's for a benefit more than just entertaining others or satisfying curiosity. So this is what I hope to get in a startup, to see development until to the point where people really are affected and it changes lives to the better.
But how do you want to change people's lives, like really? Because there's the topics about like Neuralink, where we're trying to like really have invasive implants. There's topics about having EEG in the lab, which is then really hard to translate into the real world. So like, how do you, like really, what do you want to bring to the world right now with this technology?
Yeah, I think one of the first things we can do is provide technology that allows people to monitor states, which, again, we get to the consciousness, which they otherwise wouldn't be conscious about. So technology in terms of maybe the quantified self, which the sports environment knows and uses since a couple of years or even a decade or so, it can help seeing how you develop and change that development. So just from the background, you can only change what you can measure. That's one of the aspects. At the moment at IDUN, we are trying to come up with solutions to measure certain states of mind, and to do that not in a lab environment, but in a really relevant environment, in a home environment and in real life.
Yeah, it's interesting to see what can be produced, because also we always have these topics around neurostimulation and whether or not parts of the world and the market are actually ready for these types of interactive products, or brain activity monitoring products. But there's this sentence you just said that you have to be able to, you can only change what you can measure, is really interesting because, I mean, also when we talk about quantified self, it's difficult to make sense of the data, even if you're collecting it. So how do you think about like interpretation of what's being collected? How can we make that easier for the people?
Yeah, again, here we are at a point, maybe at what we discussed before comes into play, how solid is the data that we have, how safe is the interpretation that we have. That's important. And I've seen a couple of approaches, as you mentioned, for example, neurostimulation, where I clearly think people are jumping ahead and are going maybe one step too fast. And also there are aspects in the neurotech market which I find it's really important to consider. Regulatory aspects are we're somewhere in between the medical device and the consumer healthcare device. So it's easy to put things on the market, to bring things on the market which just don't work. Yeah. So again, here we are at the important point of we should know how safe is the data, how safe is the knowledge that we build upon, and we can only do this with, I mean, we do have to perform solid experiments and validate our measurements. And then this will be the one point where it can really help not only the individual in itself, but maybe it can even help if someone is going through a therapy or through stress treatment or something like that, to be able to monitor stress states, to be able to monitor safely the sleep stages. This will help medical applications. It will help treatment, psychological treatment, even medical treatment. But I mean, then we are in the domain of medical devices, and they have really to be safe. And there is another aspect. This one thought, the other aspect of quantified self is that it just increases motivation. That's also actually a project that I've been working on before I came to IDUN. Even if people focus on what they are doing, if they get feedback from time to time over just roughly how much have they performed, or how good have they performed in a certain way, that increases motivation to keep up what you're doing.
Yeah, like you have to be able to recognize that there's a change, and then I always like to use this analogy from like game design, where games are only interesting primarily if you can understand the mechanics and also understand where you are in the game world or the game environment and how you're progressing. So like levels have to get more difficult over time. Otherwise you don't feel like you're evolving within that environment. And then ultimately we're evolving as people in life, and then as societies and communities, and being able to measure that is really exciting.
Absolutely, yes. And I mean, usually it helps to see how you progress, to see that you progress definitely helps. It also will help to change training schedules or therapeutic schedules. If we see now maybe there is a plateau that is reached and it doesn't help to progress the way we did before, so we have to change something, or maybe we decrease in performance. So we know the points when to change something in what we have been doing.
Yeah, and just understanding that cycle also, because there are times when I'm just kind of dead tired in certain parts of the week, and other times where I'm super motivated, and also just able to put a lot of energy into thinking and production. And like one dream is always just to be able to understand that cycle, so you can like tune different parts of your work life or your creative life to really take advantage of that energy and motivation when you have it. And then know when to take a break. And I'd like to say it's okay to take a break, but if I could take a break at the most effective time to recuperate, that would actually be ideal.
Yeah, that's That's really what fascinates. And again, to come back to the question with IDUN, the different thing is we tackle the problem from where we see the need, and then we try to find a solution to that. And yeah, this is what fascinates me here, that we can quite flexibly decide on which area we think is the most imminent to work on.
And from your work as a researcher, what was maybe one or two really interesting findings that you had, which you wanted to take out of the lab, but maybe haven't been able to yet?
Yeah, that started maybe 2007, 2008, when we worked on a project that dealt with how muscle fatigue develops, and not from the peripheral point of view, but from the neuroscience point of view, how the brain decides when to reduce innervation of the muscles. So we call that the brain break. When does the brain try and prevent damage from the organism due to overuse of your muscles?
So is that like where fatigue is coming from sometimes?
Exactly. Well, then that's the aspect of the muscle fatigue, that the muscles are just downregulated in order not to be overused and not to put the organism into a state where it's vulnerable to whatever, to predators or to even damage to the muscles.
And do you think that also happens with like mental fatigue? Because I mean, like sometimes I'm just like fatigued, and I realize like no matter if I even try to put a lot of more energy into pushing myself, like what I'm going to get out of that is not going to be that interesting. So I try to understand better when to stop. And I have like some friends who I think internally maybe they don't have that regulation mechanism, or they don't realize that they should be like they should just take a break right now and not continue trying to do what they were doing.
With mental fatigue, I don't know really. It's different from the respect that we don't really know what leads to fatigue. If we think about fatigue, is defined as the degradation of performance due to continuous use. So there can be several reasons why the performance degrades or decreases. One is just a change in the milieu, in the chemical milieu, and that's well investigated with the muscles. As soon as lactate accumulates, just the possibility for the fibers to contract are less well, or they are diminished. And then the regulation mechanism that we have investigated doesn't have to do with that just the brain was unable or incapable of producing the output, but it just actively downregulates. And that leads to fatigue in the muscle. Yeah. So from mental fatigue, I don't know about such regulatory mechanisms, but what is commonly discussed is that it's really just also a change in chemical milieu, for example, neurotransmitter depletion. There are just the same activity has been going on for a long time, and it's just not possible to do the same activity anymore because of changes in the chemical milieu. So that would lead to mental fatigue, but those reasons are just not well established yet. At the moment, we still debate about what's the brain mechanisms that change when you fatigue, when you start to make errors, for example, in after having hours of mental arithmetics, you start just to lose focus and make errors, and yeah, that could be different reasons. So.
And when we talk about products on the market with new technologies, in the past it was augmented reality or virtual reality or social media. What's your feeling about neurotechnology right now and the acceptance of people in society? Because sometimes we talk about the idea of needing to have a killer product, but some other technologies are really more platform-based, where they help to enhance a broad range of product experiences, like augmented reality can do. But you don't necessarily have to have like one killer augmented reality application. Like, do you have a feeling for how things could be developing over the next 5-10 years?
It's quite a broad question. I haven't thought a lot about the possible platforms or what would be the most promising way. Maybe Yeah, maybe I'm not even getting the question right, but I think
Like, what's
yeah,
one problem that neurotechnology could fix right now?
yeah, getting more solid data over a period of time that right now we, especially in the medical field, I know that we rely on pretty much introspective judgments, and medical personnel also relies on what the patients tell them pretty much.
Yeah.
And in psychology and psychotherapy, that's also the case even more. So this is where neurotechnology can really help and will probably have a big impact over the next couple of years. And what kind of platform that would be that is most promising? I really think it should be wearable devices which are non-invasive and which are easy to apply and still come up with a solid data where we need to have some idea about how good is the data quality and how solid is the data. This is really essential in order for those devices to really help.
Yeah, I mean, the question of invasiveness, it's really interesting because you also have then that physical perception that there's a device which is now inside your body, inside your mind, reading your thoughts, taking over your body.
kind of it like developing into cyborgs, but this is also
Yeah, for sure.
This is also an interesting it's an interesting thought, I think. How much do we rely on technology, not only on neurotechnology, but on technology which augments our lives and our
yeah,
tasks.
Even just like eyeglasses, like the augmentation that's had on society is like almost impossible to calculate.
Eyeglasses, hearing aids, and with hearing aids, we are even closer to the neurotech. I mean, that's not only physical change to the auditory signal, but it's also measuring at the same time. Also, the use of mobile devices to augment our memory. I mean, this is
collective
coming more and
intelligence.
more. So it's already impacting the way how we think and the way how we solve our tasks. So measuring more about the organism it can help the devices in doing what we need, and it can improve us in helping or in performing our tasks.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it all develops.
Yeah, maybe another aspect is whether we just measure or whether we also try to change the way how the brain works or how the organism works by stimulating. And I do see this as two radically different ways in a way, but I mean, the transition is not really black and white. I mean, we can change how the brain works by stimulating the brain either directly with electrical stimulations, implanted electrodes, or transcutaneous and TDCS or things like that. Or we can change how the brain works by stimulating with visual stimuli or auditory stimuli. And this is what psychotherapy does. So they also changed how the brain works. We can also have big impact on the brain, unwanted impact by stressing the brain with inducing post-traumatic stress disorders.
So like that kind of makes me think about this dividing line between, we think about consciousness as like who we are, and we don't always like to think about how these environmental factors are then defining who we are as a person. Like, I know if I want to challenge myself, I can choose to go mountaineering, I can put myself in physically challenging situations, I can put myself into a startup, which is mentally very challenging. Do you have a feeling about the dividing line for consciousness between what can we design, what can we engineer for people, and what's theoretically inherent within us?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a question about how, to what extent can we form ourselves, can we form our consciousness and our
Yeah, like how
self-perception.
malleable are we, do you
Yeah,
think?
yeah.
So can we go from being an average person where we think we can only achieve a certain level of intelligence or capabilities in life to like making a giant leap just by using a neurotechnology device or some other augmentation?
Mhm. Yeah, the question of how big the leap is, I don't dare to answer. I know, I know it's a long way until I think we will get to a big leap. I think there are still big leaps to do for humanity, and one of those big leaps certainly has to do with how far AI will help us to develop as humans, and also help us to solve environmental problems. But the optimization, like optimize our brain performance, I don't see very promising ways at the moment. I mean, all the hope that is being put into neurostimulation, for example, there is little evidence that neurostimulation works in a healthy individual in order to improve like memory or attention. But where I see a big potential is, as you've mentioned before, to find the right phases, to find the times when we are able to excel in one task or the other task, and use those times, or to find the times when we need recreation, and to really make more use and better use of the capabilities that we already have. And by this, I could see a lot of possibility to develop also and to improve our, let's say, output.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, I think, what we can imagine for the future.
Yeah. You know, the brain has developed over a long period of time, and human evolution, I think it's quite effective. And to change the ways how our brains work, this is, I mean, I know some good examples from therapeutic approaches to change the ways how brains should not work, and to bring them into a normal range. But to improve a normal brain just by changing the ways how it works with any implanted or whatever kind of device, I am less optimistic.
Well, either way, we're going to find out over the next year what we can achieve in this area.
Yeah.
So very happy to be working with you at IDUN. You really bring this whole different dimension of neuroscience to the team. And yeah, looking forward to the rest of 2021 and seeing what happens.
Yeah, it's going to be a great journey with IDUN together and seeing what we can achieve in that direction.
And maybe next time we won't have to be wearing corona masks because everything will have changed in the world. But for now, we bid you adieu. Looking forward to talking to you later on the next podcast, and come check us out for brain technology if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.